You're listening to A Universe for Nothing by Dr. Graham Cron. Dr. Cron holds a PhD in physics and is an adjunct faculty member at Biola University in La Mirada, California. This breakout session was recorded at the Apologetics Canada Conference on March 8, 2014 at Northview Community Church.
All right, so I'm going to get started here, but first of all, just let me introduce myself. My name is Graham Cron. I'm originally from Abbotsford. I grew up just around here. And I went to MEI, actually, for high school. And then after that, I went to UBC. And in the last few years, the last number of years, I've been down in California, where I earned my doctorate in physics. And theoretical physics. And currently, I'm teaching down at Biola University and doing research in the field of science and religion. So questions related to science and religion are questions that interest me. So the topic that I've proposed for today has to do with purpose in the universe from a scientific perspective, but also from a Christian perspective, how to address this question. Okay, so I think that is a very important question, and basically I want to ask the question, is there any ultimate purpose to the universe or our existence? And because this is a question that I have asked myself ever since I was young, and I was convinced that there was an answer to this question, that there must be an answer to this question. So I'm asking this question as a physicist, but also as a real person who is seeking a comprehensive and coherent picture of reality. So is there any ultimate cosmic purpose to our existence? And if there is, how might we find out what this purpose is? And more to the point, does it even matter? Is it relevant? And then how does God factor into this discussion at all? So these are the types of questions that I will attempt to guide you through today. But in no way do I plan that this will be sort of a comprehensive discussion where we get to go over everything. Because there's a lot that could be said here. And by saying some things, I'm going to neglect saying a lot of other things, right? So what I hope is that in the talk today that at least we get to just think through some ideas together and stimulate further thinking and discussion relating to the question of purpose. Okay, now, most everyone, so purpose, let's talk about this for a little bit. So most everyone wants to affirm that there is purpose. And in fact, it would be very hard to live life if you didn't think that your life had any ultimate purpose or significance. So the main point that I want you to take away from today, and again, I'm just going to be throwing some ideas out there and going through some things. But to start discussion here, but the main point is that only a Christian, or only the Christian, can legitimately and consistently claim that his or her life has purpose. Okay, and where I'm going with this is, so that's the main point, and where I'm going with this is that there cannot be any purpose without God. If there is no God, then ultimately there is no purpose. But you'll notice that most people today, whether they believe in God or not, think that there is purpose. Because we, as humans, want to affirm purpose to our lives and want to think that there is a deeper meaning than just, a deeper meaning, a reason for our existence. Okay, so what's sort of a popular claim today that is being thrown around is that somehow science has removed God from the picture altogether. That because of the recent findings in astrophysics and biology, and I'm going to be sticking more to the physics side of things, but science has basically removed God from the picture. So let's look at that claim for a second here. So if some of you may have heard of one of the most famous living physicists today, his name is Stephen Hawking, who is a self-pronounced atheist, denies the existence of God and thinks that physics explains everything. So is Stephen Hawking right? Has physics eliminated God? Is it now completely irrational to believe in God because of the claims of modern physics? Well, let me just make it very simple for you and give you the answer right off the bat. The answer is no. Okay, so the answer is no. And I hope I've solved all your questions and answered all the problems here. So now we have the next 40 minutes. We can talk about whatever you want. Okay, so, all right. But I just want to challenge this popular notion that somehow science eliminates God, particularly physics. And I think there's good reason to do this. If we take the biblical proverb in Proverbs 18, where it says, the one who first states his case seems right until his neighbor or another comes and questions or examines him. So what does it even mean to say that science has eliminated God or made belief in God irrational? Well, let me suggest three different possible meanings of interpreting this. And one would be that maybe this claim means that you don't need to believe in God in order to do science. And I think that this is obviously true, and speaking as a theoretical physicist, I can tell you that most of my colleagues were atheists, and they do great physics. You don't need to believe in God to do physics. This is obviously true. It's God's world governed by His laws and open to rational inquiry whether you believe in His existence or not. So you don't need God to do science. That's not really the issue. Does it possibly mean that science has disproved God's existence? Somehow the claims of modern physics have made God more likely to not exist than to exist. And I think that this is not true. And just to give you an example here, Stephen Hawking recently wrote a book in 2010. He co-authored with Caltech physicist Leonard Mlodinow. And this book is called The Grand Design. And it's kind of a misleading title because he doesn't believe there was a grand designer, yet he called his book The Grand Design. And what he tries to do in this book is tries to explain the existence of the universe apart from God. In particular, one of the lines that he writes in the book is that given the law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. And I should clarify what he means by this statement, because what he really means is not that the universe created itself out of absolutely nothing, but what he really means by this statement, and if you were to go through the book and unpack it and look at some more of the science, what he's really saying here is that through spontaneous fluctuations in this quantum vacuum state in the origin of the universe somehow tunnels into existence from its initial cosmological singularity. So, to simplify that, what his claim is that basically the universe changed. The way he explains the existence of the universe is by saying that it came from something to something. How you get the universe is it went from something to something. It changed states. Simply put, Hawking is saying the universe created the universe. And therefore, there is nothing to be explained. We have the laws of physics, the law of gravity in particular, that explains quantum tunneling, and therefore no need for God, or no need for a further explanation. Now the problem with this is, if we were to think about this, if we were to say that some entity X created Y, you need to assume the existence of X in order to explain the existence of Y. If you say, on the other hand, that X created X, you have to assume the existence of X in order to explain the existence of X, which becomes logically inconsistent. You have to assume that it exists before you can explain its existence. X, in our case, the universe, is what is trying to be explained, and so to posit its existence, in order to explain its existence, becomes arguing in a circle and becomes incoherent. So it's really interesting when you look at these claims. Has science eliminated God or proved God doesn't exist? Well, not really. These are more popular claims that we need to think about. In this book, he also advocates a position he calls model-dependent realism, which is actually, first of all, he denounces any sort of theological or philosophical reasoning, and he thinks that science is the only way to know truth, but I'll come back to that in a moment here. But according to his view, model-dependent realism, there is no objective way the universe really is. But the scientific models we employ superimpose themselves onto reality and thereby create reality. And he calls this view model-dependent realism, and this is also known as ontological pluralism. So somehow the models that we create the models we actually write to describe the universe actually make the universe the way it is. This is basically saying there is no real way the universe is, but our models force the universe to be the way it is. Now, I think that it's interesting to note that Stephen Hawking, for example, he, up until 2009, he held the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at the University of Cambridge. And this was the chair, this is considered to be the most prestigious chair in science in the world. And he held this chair for about 30 years, and this chair was originally held by the famous Isaac Newton around 310 years earlier. So he's widely regarded, even to this day, as the greatest living scientist. And I think if we just start looking at some of his claims, he does great science. But one thing that we can learn is that when we think about and we question, nonsense is still nonsense even when it's uttered by very high-powered scientists. What's important is the arguments and where it goes from there. So I don't think that science can legitimately answer these questions of purpose. So does science actually hinder, or I should say, does God hinder scientific progress? Might be this claim that somehow because we have science and we have models that describe the world, we don't need God now because the science takes the place of God. So does science and God, are they mutually exclusive? Does God hinder the progress of science? And I would like to make the point that although we hear that over and over again on popular level, programs can be very misleading on the facts that they give us. For instance, on the Discovery Channel, they're not completely addressing all the questions. So, does God hinder scientific progress? Well, far from it. Many historians have actually argued that science, medicine, technology, and you look at hospitals, and all of these were originally Christian institutions made possible by Christians. Christians were actually the very ones who founded science in Western Europe. And some philosophers of science have asked the question, why is it that science arose in the 16th and 17th century in Western Europe, as opposed to other great civilizations that were around at the time? Africa, China, India, other groups of people. Why didn't science emerge in these cultures? It's not that these cultures were somehow insophisticated or the people were less intelligent. Why is it that Western Europe birthed modern science and technology? And what philosophers of science have argued is that it's precisely because of the reason that these cultures lacked the unifying concept of a creator God. Now, at first glance, the world seems very random and chaotic and almost archaic. If you look around you, you might get the impression that you can imagine being a tribesman out on the plains of Africa, right? Things just seem to happen and there seems to be no purpose. The world is very confusing and chaotic. However, it was the Christians who believed in a creator God that expected the universe to be rationally intelligible at every level of creation because they believed it was the product of a rational mind. So in commenting on this, on the rise of science, Alfred North Whitehead writes that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver, namely God. And if we were to go back to the most famous scientist, the founder of modern science, Isaac Newton, he didn't have any problem with belief in God and science. And as is well known, Isaac Newton was the one who discovered the law of gravity and wrote, when he discovered the law of gravity, he didn't discover the law and say, now that I've discovered the law of gravity, I no longer need to posit God, or I no longer need God because I have a law. On the very contrary, he wrote the Principia Mathematica, which is arguably the greatest work of science ever produced. And if you were to go to the University of Cambridge, one of the most famous physics laboratory in the world is the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge. And this was founded by James Clerk Maxwell, the founder of electromagnetic theory, in the late 19th century. But what he wrote, or what was, if you go to this laboratory, what was inscribed on the doors of this laboratory are the words in Latin, but the English translation, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." And we see that Maxwell was a believer in God, and many of these physicists were. And it's only been in the last number of years that people somehow think that God and science are incompatible with each other. Right? And this really happened around the turn of the 20th century, when a lot of evangelicals began retreating from academia, and many of the institutions were just given over into secular hands. For instance, the Christian institutions like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were all Christian, and then they were just given over. In fact, the motto of the University of Oxford is Dominus Illuminato Mea, which basically means the Lord is my light. The oldest university in the world, which goes back to the 11th century, and the original lectures given at Oxford were lectures from the Psalms of David going back to the 11th century. And this is what this great institution was founded on, these words that the Lord is my light. So there was never seen to be a contradiction between belief in God and utmost rational inquiry. So has Stephen Hawking or other guys, other famous scientists, eliminated God? Well, I think not. And many people are starting to recognize this, because many of his colleagues have been criticizing him because he has a misunderstanding of the God that Christians believe in. Christians are not believing in some God to explain what they don't understand. They don't believe in a God of the gaps, so to speak, that as science progresses, God just fills up the gaps in our knowledge that we don't understand. Christians believe in a God who created the whole universe and is in charge of everything we do understand and everything that we don't. So he's a God of the whole show. So far from science eliminating God, I think we have good reason to think that the question hasn't been settled by science. So, as a physicist and a Christian, I believe that answering this question, it's important to actually, God is very important to finding an answer to this question of purpose. And in particular, as a Christian, I believe that the person of Christ is absolutely central to finding purpose in life. And there are questions that we would like answered that science cannot answer. So J.I. Packer, in his classic book, Knowing God, makes the following statement: "He who often thinks of God will have a larger mind than the man who simply plods around this narrow globe. The most excellent study for expanding the soul is the science of Christ and Him crucified, and the knowledge of the Godhead in the glorious Trinity. Nothing will so enlarge the intellect, nothing so magnify the whole soul of man as a devout, earnest, continued investigation of the great subject of the deity." On the Christian view, God is central to a coherent and comprehensive picture of reality. Right thinking always precedes right feeling in the Christian faith. And Packer goes on to write, "We are cruel to ourselves if we try to live in this world without knowing about the God whose world it is and who runs it. The world becomes a strange, mad, painful place, and life in it a disappointing and unpleasant business for those who do not know about God. Disregard the study of God, and you sentence yourself to stumble and blunder through life blindfolded, as it were, with no sense of direction and no understanding of what surrounds you. This way you can waste your life and lose your soul." And it must grieve God to see how many people needlessly suffer because they have a false or inadequate view of who He is. And this view can be influenced in our culture by false beliefs and false ideas about science and so forth. And put very simply, the whole thing wrong with the universe is basically this: false knowledge. So the whole thing wrong with the universe is that we believe lies, we believe wrong things, and we desire wrong things. When you believe something wrong, you think you have a false idea of what will bring happiness, purpose, and meaning. But if it is in fact a lie, we find out that it ends up being empty instead of leading to happiness, it leads to shame, guilt, and misery. So how does sin factor into this? Well, into the question of purpose. Well, on a Christian understanding, what is sin? Well, it's much more than just doing something God forbids. God forbids something for reasons. Sin is a violation of purpose, the purpose which God intended in God's omnibenevolence, what He intended. It's misdirected worship. It's turning the heart onto something other than that which is most perfect, most holy, that is God. So that is why it must grieve God to find men worshiping other institutions and other forms of knowledge that are less than His perfect knowledge. And God's knowledge is a comprehensive knowledge which includes all faculties of our reason and intuition. So that includes science as part of the knowledge God has given us. So that is why misdirected worship is at the central of what sin is, worshiping something other than God. And this is why the Apostle Paul, when he arrived with his traveling companion Barnabas in Lystra, he saw the people there engaged in false worship, and he cried out and said, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God." And then later on, he came upon Athens, the famous city from the Greco-Roman world, a cultural center with some of the leading thinkers of the time. And it says in Acts that his heart was grieved within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols, intelligent men worshiping other things. And then, but then he does have a chance to correct their thinking. These weren't stupid people. They weren't ignorant people, but they had misdirected worship. They had chosen to serve the lesser than the greater, which is God. So Paul stands up, and you're probably familiar with the sermon that he was able to deliver at the Areopagus in Mars Hill there in Athens. But he gets up, and it says in great boldness he proclaims, and let me just read through this here. He says, "The one whom you worship in ignorance, him I proclaim to you, God, who made the world and everything in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He worshipped with men's hands, as though He needed anything, since He gives to all life and breath and all things. He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. For in Him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your poets have said, for we also are His offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art or man's devising. Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because He has appointed a day on which He will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom He has ordained. And He has given assurance of this to all by raising Him from the dead." So what Paul is saying is that God has offered true, comprehensive knowledge through His offer of salvation to live out the purpose, which is good. And when man believes that his purposes are above God's purposes, then he violates the reason for which he was created and finds himself lost in misery and brokenness. This is why Peter speaks of being called out of darkness into His glorious light. So a proper view of God is absolutely essential for the Christian hope. So this question of purpose, again, there's a lot that could be said here, and I just want to give you a couple of ideas here about a couple of ways of thinking about this question, or ways of addressing this question. One way would be simply to list a bunch of trivia or science facts or data or things like that. And I think that all truth is God's truth, so when you learn things from science, they ultimately point towards God. But I think that is an inadequate approach if we just focus on a bunch of facts. The facts are important, but what's more important is how we integrate those facts in a comprehensive way. So the approach that I prefer to take when looking at this question is more of an integrated approach, where we draw from all of our knowledge, all of our experience, all of the data, and try to form a coherent picture of the world. So some people, especially naturalists and physicalists and many physicists today, would want to say that why not use just science to answer all the questions? Can't science answer all the questions that we have? And my argument is that this is just too simplistic an approach, because science is very limited in the kinds of explanations that it can offer to us. So to give you an example about the limitations here, let's consider the example of, let's talk about a solar eclipse. Okay, so what can science tell you about a solar eclipse? Well, it can tell you what the prerequisites for a solar eclipse are. Three prerequisites. You need a luminous body, aka the sun. You need an eclipsing body, the moon. And you need an observer platform, the earth. So science will tell you that you need these three components in order to observe eclipse. And that's conditioned with the right alignment, and we will observe these solar eclipses. But what science can't tell us is, why do these eclipses occur? So consider the following, that the chances of observing an eclipse on Earth are actually very, very, maybe I should phrase it in terms of the chance that there's an eclipse happening anywhere is very, very rare. Because you need just the right distances between the Earth and the moon and the sun, and you need the right alignment in order for the moon to block out the sun. Okay, and but what we actually find on our Earth is not just any eclipse, but a perfect solar eclipse are possible, and they do happen every now and then. So if you think about it, the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but the sun is also 400 times farther away from the Earth than the moon is. And this is just the perfect combination so that we get these perfect solar eclipses. Now, while solar eclipses happen everywhere, there's a planet and a moon orbiting around. While if you actually look at all the moons in our solar system, you find out that the possible number of moons that could possibly give an eclipse are 68. And none of the other planets experience solar eclipses. And it just so happens that the one place in our solar system where there are where there are observers is the one place where solar eclipses occur. Now you might wonder, okay, that's great. Who really cares about solar eclipses? Right? And that's a good question. I mean, I don't normally think about them myself either. But if we were to think about, could there be any purpose or reason that God is directing the universe that would allow that might be there? Could this be some sort of a sign? Well, if you've ever observed one, indirectly of course, you know it's a very beautiful sighting. But it's also revealed something very interesting that was not expected, and that's that when a solar eclipse happens, it's actually allowed scientists to uncover many mysteries about the universe. And the first one was actually the composition of the sun. So when the moon completely blocked out the sun, and that blocking is actually within less than 1%, it actually allowed scientists, through spectral analysis, to determine the composition of the sun. And this is how helium was discovered. By observing the sun's chromosphere, observing the atmosphere of the sun, and then understanding this process of stellar nucleosynthesis. All of this came from the fact that eclipses happened. We were able to determine what the sun was made of, how stellar fusion works, and all of these processes. And the other interesting thing is that during the famous eclipse of 1919, it was actually Einstein's general theory of relativity that received its first confirmation. So the question was basically, if Einstein is right, gravity can bend light. But up until this point, it was not able to be tested just because the sun was too luminous that it drowned out all the background of all the other stars. But when the moon moves right in front of the sun, scientists were able to observe stars that should have been invisible, but because of Einstein's general theory, bended light around, and it received its first confirmation. And again, this was only possible from a perfect solar eclipse. And if you're not aware, general relativity is one of the foundational theories now of modern physics, along with quantum mechanics, and has been a very successful theory, and has actually had many applications that involve satellite communication and so forth, and signal propagation. So it's allowed humanity to progress, to develop technology, to discover deep workings of the universe, these seemingly odd coincidences. So is this all just a coincidence, or does it tell us something deep and profound about the universe? So my point here is that science cannot answer these questions because science is limited in scope. It gives no reason why, based on the enormous improbability that an eclipse would actually occur. So we need a proper methodological framework for interpreting the significance of science if we are to ask the most interesting questions. Science only gives explanation in terms of mechanism and law. Now, anytime someone gives you an explanation that is just too cut and dry and too black and white, that's probably an explanation that either they themselves are closed-minded, or they haven't thought too hard about it, or they're not willing to investigate the alternatives. Something that Christians are often claimed and to be closed-minded and have narrow thinking and so forth. But these are interesting questions, and I think anyone who is genuinely seeking after truth would want to find answers to, what is the purpose of my life? Is there any purpose? How might I know what that is? Going back to Stephen Hawking again, in his book, he writes that he has an over-optimistic view of science, because he writes that scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. And he goes on to develop this, but he basically seems to believe in a type of scientism. A type of scientism which is roughly the idea that the only truth that we can know is scientific truth. And what I would like to say here is that this is clearly false. This is clearly a false epistemology because it is self-referentially incoherent. And what this means is basically that scientism, it cannot be true that the only way to know truth is through science. Because if we were to ask the scientist, what about that claim? If you can only know truth if it's a scientific truth, that claim itself is not a scientific truth. So if scientism is true, that the only truth that can be known is scientific truth, then that statement itself is false. So if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's false, and either way, it can be disregarded as not understandable. So clearly we need some other ways of discerning truth and figuring out how to make sense of this world, going back to the quote by Packer that I read earlier. So can we know truths outside of science? For example, the most basic question we could ask is Christianity true? And if it is true, do we need 100% certainty before believing it? Is absolute certainty needed in order to hold the belief rationally? And I would say obviously not, because absolute certainty is virtually impossible for anything. To know anything that is meaningful with absolute certainty. So what is absolute certainty? Well, that just means there's no way to doubt the proposition. And this would be basically, if we were to think about what types of knowledge might fall into this category, that would be maybe definitional truths, axiomatic or tautological truths, things that are true by definition. So it's impossible to doubt them, like a triangle has 3 sides. You can't doubt that because it's a definition. So the question is, how much evidence do we need to believe in Christianity? And this raises the question of the level of persuasion. How much evidence is needed before a belief can be rationally affirmed? And there's different levels or degrees of certainty. There's the absolute, which I mentioned already, which is, okay, you cannot doubt a proposition because it's true by definition. There's psychological certainty, which is just intuitive certainty that it's very, very likely. It's 95% certain, but again, it cannot be proven 100%, but it's very, very certain. There's knowing something beyond a reasonable doubt. We might put that around 80%. You're fully satisfied with the explanation. And then there's clear and convincing, something that's highly probable. And then we come to the preponderance level. And this is something that is more likely true than false. So for Christians, Christianity starts at the preponderance level. This is the threshold or the cutoff. As soon as you have more reason to suspect something is true than false, at this point, why withhold belief? This is the threshold. And the Christian life starts here, and as you mature in your beliefs and in your faith, you become more and more certain. And when I speak here of certainty, I don't simply mean empirical certainty, but I mean all ways that we know things through experience, through knowledge of the world, through relationships, through different things. There's different ways to know things. And as we become more and more mature in our faith, we become more and more certain. Because biblically speaking, faith is not just knowledge. It is not just trust, I should say. It's not just blind faith, and never in the Bible is faith described as blind trust. But faith actually involves three components: knowledge, you need to know something; assent, you need to direct your intellect towards accepting that knowledge; and then trust, placing your faith in something you have good reason to know is true. Okay, so where I'm going with this is that truth actually matters. And if we're going to find out the purpose, if we're going to through our lives develop or try to understand the purpose of why we're here, it's going to involve the question of truth. We want to know what is actually true, and there's a lot that God has given us to start to address that question. Okay, and again. Not just truth, but not just knowing the truth, but actually actually living in a way that's consistent with those beliefs. So, what do I mean by that? Living in a way that's consistent with those beliefs. Well, if we go back in history and you look at some of the main themes that came out of Protestant scholastic theology, and these were the two ideas that, number one, hell is real, and number two is the uniqueness of Christ for salvation, or aka Christian particularism. Basically, these are the two central themes that came out of the Reformation in the Protestant tradition. And basically, it's not just enough to know the truth, but to believe it. You need the true Jesus and you need the true gospel. A personalized religious experience is not enough. Trying to be the right person and do the right thing will never get you there. Because this is really sort of a theme in our culture today, which would really be, it's not biblical Christianity, but it's ethical monotheism or moralism. And it's a false gospel where people become motivated out of a sense of guilt and shame and obligation, false ideas about perfection, instead of the law of grace and liberty and the love of Christ. Because Christ himself said, I have come that you may have life. Ethical monotheism is just become a better person yourself. Study harder, work harder, live a better life, and God will love you more. This is a false gospel. This is ethical monotheism. This is trying to be better yourself rather than resting in the righteousness which we have from Christ, the imputed alien righteousness which Christ gives us through his death and resurrection. So this is the truth matters, and we need to get, basically before we start asking all these questions, we need to make sure we get Christianity right. We all need to make sure for ourselves that we have the true Jesus and the true gospel. This is what sets people free now and for eternity. It's the central truths of Christianity. And not getting sidetracked on other things, but if we get that right, everything else will follow. So, What this means for us is that I have 5 minutes or so left here. And again, there's so much I could say here. A lot more I could say here. But basically, actually in my next session, I know you'll go to another session or whatnot, but I'm going to do maybe a little bit more of a technical discussion, do some more science actually that I won't have time to get to today, but or at this very moment. But just to try to motivate the question a little bit, is this question of purpose as being an interesting question and one that's very important, and it's grounded in Christianity, the person of Christ. So if these two beliefs, if they actually matter, or if they're actually true, hell is real and the uniqueness of Christ for salvation, what's going to follow for the life of every Christian is that they're going to seek truth. They're going to, at whatever cost, seek out to find out what's true. Start removing falsehoods. And live for what matters. Because those beliefs have eternal significance, right? Now, too many Christians are trying to achieve sinless perfection. They think of religion as this ethical moralism type of becoming a better person, where in Christianity the righteousness is in Christ. And the problem with it is because as Christians we still believe lies. And lies are haunting us, and that's what causes us to believe wrongly and therefore desire wrongly. This is like I said before, this is the entire thing wrong with the universe, is we believe wrong things and therefore desire wrong things. And as soon as you believe a falsehood, you reconstitute your desires and start believing falsehoods rather than truths. This is where all the problems start. And the more falsehoods one believes, the more appetites one has for wrong things, wrong thinking. So the whole history of the church, if you were to go back 2,000 years to the Apostle Paul and then the fathers that followed after, and the whole history of Christianity, it comes back to, it's a story of people coming back to true knowledge of God. This is what sets people free from bondage, because sin, as a violation of purpose, believing wrong things, ends up resulting in brokenness. And sadly, man doesn't believe God and has to learn of the horrors of rebellion firsthand. And the fact of it is, when we ask the question of purpose, is if there is a purpose to the world and why we were created, if we violate that purpose and go our own way, there's going to be results for that. There's going to be going against the way God intended nature to be. Consequences for not following reality. So the science here is basically, the idea here is we want a comprehensive knowledge, understanding of reality, and what is truth, something that we can cohere and put together in a way that makes sense. Because of Christ's words, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And this is exactly what they wrote in the Westminster Catechism when they said, this is the end of man right here. What's the chief end of man? Well, it's to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Understanding what that means is going to be first thinking correctly, which will allow us to feel correctly, which will be able to allow us to experience the world in the way God intended it to experience it. Now, the last thing I'm going to say here before I end here is I encourage everyone here, again, there's so much more I could say here or we could go into, but where I'm going to stop here is say that I encourage everyone to continue to seek after truth, after God's truth, and not feel like you have to figure it out on your own. Because as Christians, we stand on the shoulders of some of the greatest intellectuals in all of history. And if you go back, you would see that any question that we can ask today has pretty much been asked before in the past, and there's been a good answer to it. And now we have the benefits of modern science that can also aid us in the quest for truth. Because Christianity is a thinking faith, and it's not purely experiential, but it's grounded in an ontological reality, in something that is real, right? So if we get closer to that reality, we're going to see Christ more Because it was Anselm who wrote that Christianity is not this blind faith which we see caricaturized in the media today, but it's a faith seeking understanding, seeking comprehensive understanding. And so I suggest that the way to start addressing this question is to seek comprehensive knowledge in Christian theology, in experience, in all facets of our life, and try to bring these together, which can be united in Christ. All right, so that is it. Thank you for your time.